Can you check it? Make sure it sounds good. Do I have any announcements? Yeah, 7 o'clock. Permanent change. So make sure you get here at 6:55. Good to go. Let's pray. Father, we just thank you for bringing us here tonight. Lord, thanks for giving us your blood. Thanks for saving us, dying on that cross for our sins. Lord, giving us this Bible so that we could claw our way back to some semblance of what you want us to be. Pray for the words to say tonight. Pray for our hearts to be open. Those folks that aren't with us tonight, be safe and come back whenever they get here, Lord. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. This is a weird book. It's just a weird book. I think, the most famous thing about the book is God's not in it. Well, God's not mentioned in the book. The word God's not there. The word Lord's not there. God is not in the book. It's likely a historical recording by a Persian preserved by God and put in the Bible to tell the story of this woman, Esther, the person who the book's named after. It's the only thing that would make sense that if a Jew wrote it, there'd be God in there somewhere. I mean, it's a completely different book than all the other books I've read. And so I believe it's just a recording of events that took place in this kingdom, and Esther being the main character in it. But there's other characters. There's this Ahasuerus, the king. His name in history, I'm told, is Xerxes. Xerxes. And there's secular history written about this guy, that around this time he goes into Greece and tries to attack Greece, and Greece hands him his rear end and becomes sulky. And we kind of see a reference to this later on, but it's not exactly right. But it's not exactly clear. But history says this Ahasuerus is Xerxes. And then you got Mordecai. He's the cousin of Esther. He takes in Esther as a child when her parents are dead. Raises her as his own kid. Then you got Evil, Bad, Wicked Haman, who's played by Brian Daigle in a play at Grace Baptist Church. Haman, he's the antagonist of the story. He's a picture of the devil. He's a picture of the adversary. He represents the adversary to God's people. And he's the king's second in command. He's also the son of Agag, who heard of. And he was an Amalekite that shouldn't be alive because Saul was supposed to kill him. He said they just cut off Agag's thumbs. Remember that? They cut off Agag's thumbs instead of doing what he was told to do. And Esther is just who she is. She's just Esther. She's just a young Jewish woman, captive. She's nothing. She's nobody. And she's just doing what she does. Nothing. She has nothing to offer. She's got no riches, no power, no position, nothing other than what God gave her. That apparently was her looks. She had nothing going for her except that, and the fact that she's a pretty cool chick, how you look at it. So she had the looks and she had an attitude that allowed her to become the hero of this book. But what we learn about her in chapter 4, she's the good guy. She saves everybody. But even if she didn't, somebody else would have. It just wouldn't have been her. We learn that in chapter 4, that yes, she is the hero, but only because she acted. God was going to get someone. God doesn't need anybody. Nobody's indispensable in the book. Nobody's indispensable in the church. Nobody's indispensable in life. And she isn't indispensable. She just happened to stand up. She stood up and did what she was supposed to do at the right time. So the theme of the book, if there is one, is life is hard. Pain happens. What are you going to do when life gets hard? Are you going to run from God, hide from God, or are you going to cling to God and take a stand? That's basically the whole book. So God's not mentioned in the book. So here, who is that? Unfamiliar face, stranger danger. Ah. Okay, so life is hard. Are we going to run away and hide from God, or are we going to cling to God and take a stand? God's working behind the scenes. Even though he's not mentioned in the book, he's working in the book. God is always He is the heavy hidden hand of the man, working the machinations behind the scenes. That's God. And he's working the machinations. Now, what we see in the beginning is, and we'll read something. I'm sure you all read the book in anticipation of this glorious study tonight. She hides at first. And she hides even up to the point where Mordecai has to tell her, you need to step up, or someone else is going to step up, and you're not going to make it. And she hides, but she also teaches us that you can't avoid God's destiny. One way or the other, God will be glorified, and you will do God's will, whether it's willingly or kicking and screaming. God will have his way. God will get glory out of everything. She just decides to step in and step up and be wrong with it. And it's just, for me, there's a sense in this book that it's just an observation by the world of people looking into the life of God's people and seeing God work in that life. God, like I said, God's not going to let you. Okay, so high level outline, just very, very high level. Chapter 1 and 2 is just about Esther becoming she's in Persia. She's a captive. She's a slave. She's lower than slave. She's nobody. She's just one of these Jews that got taken into captivity. That's all she is. She's not special. Nothing special about her family. I think there's not much I can tell you about the family. Chapter 3 and 4, Mordecai shows up more. Or rather, he becomes sort of not an anti-hero, but he becomes the catalyst for the crisis. If this was a movie, this would be the guy that made the bonehead error or took a stand, and now everybody's going to suffer because of the stand he takes. And the stand that he took was that he wasn't going to pay homage to Haman, the man. In a way, a very loose way, Mordecai can be considered a type of the Holy Spirit. He's working behind the scenes to protect Esther, and through that, his own people. So he's working behind the scenes. And he basically reports to Esther in chapter 4, verse 14. He gives her information that she needs. And he basically, and we'll get there later, but he basically says, speak now for a little peace, because something's going to happen. Someone's going to save us. It might as well be you. If it's not you, someone else will. You and your family will be dead. So he's urging her to act on something like the Holy Spirit did when we were told, you better get saved, you need to die, and go to hell. So anyways, very loose type. I wouldn't hang my whole faith on it, but just putting that out there. The rest of the book, chapter 5 through 10, is Esther outwitting Haman. Not even trying, really, just by being herself. Taking a stand and then continuing to take the stand. Once she takes the first stand, to take the next step. And after her first leap of faith that we saw in chapter 4, that we will see in chapter 4. Haman winds up hung on the gallows that he created for Mordecai. And he, if you read the book, he provokes the king to issue a decree to kill all the Jews. Because one guy wouldn't bow down. This Haman had everything a guy like him could have in the kingdom. But the one thing he couldn't have was his ego stroked by one Jew. Just one Jew. He just wanted this one Jew. Right? And it wound up destroying him and his whole family. There's a lot of moral lessons you can learn out of the book. I'm sure there's a lot of doctrine out of the book. You're not going to hear it here tonight. I'm just going to get through the book. We're going to do the whole book tonight. So chapter 1, you got what you might be told is a rebellious wife. And I kind of agree with everything she did. So look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 107 and 20 provinces. That in those days, there it is again, that in those days, the brain ought to be thinking about the second coming of Christ. See, in those days, tribulation, in that days, in those days, that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. And he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. This has to be written by someone that's not a Jew. I mean, the way they're describing this king, right? So anyways, and when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto the great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. You got everybody sitting there. This is the same Shushan that we find Nehemiah in chapter 1. And I'll be honest, I can't prove that Ahasuerus is this guy Xerxes, but I couldn't find anything to disprove. I found because if what I'm reading is true, Xerxes is really the father of Artaxerxes that we've seen before. So take that for what you will. What secular history teaches, the Bible doesn't tell us this, but secular history teaches that Artaxerxes killed his father to take his throne, and that's why he's on the throne. Take that for it. But in chapter 1, the king's having a party for his princes and his servants and the nobles. The party lasts 140 days. That's a party. 140 minutes into a party, Mike gives. Let's go, sign again. But after that party, he threw another party for the little people. It said both great and small. Okay? So they had a big party, and this party lasted 7 days. Not to be outdone, while this is going on, Queen Vashti, that I didn't introduce, she's the rebellious wife, right? She had a party for the women at the same time. And look at verses 8 and 9. It's great. There's booze. There's an open bar. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. None did compel. There's an open bar, but according to the law of the land, they couldn't be compelled to follow a law. A law was set, and they were not compelled to drink. People had a choice whether or not to partake of the booze in this party, but this woman, Vashti, didn't have a choice to show up on command to this drunk after a 140-day party. And that's why it's funny, because the commentaries call her a rebellious wife. I'm like, okay, I agree with her when she did. Like, how many people love to entertain? Nobody. The only thing worse than a drunk woman is a drunk man. That's all. They're only the two worst things in the world inside a drunk woman is a drunk man. And that's exactly what's happening. This drunk king is now going to call on his wife to perform for him in front of his friends after this long, drawn-out party. But while the people had the right to not drink, Vashti didn't have a right to not perform for this drunk. So then in the next verses here, verses 10 through 22, I'm not sure I want to read all those, so I won't. But in the rest of those verses, the king had been showing off all his riches and his glory and everything. He impressed them as much as he possibly could, and he had to do more, because we always have to do more. I mean, when I was a kid, crest was the only thing that would keep my teeth in my head. And then when I was in my teens, improved crest was the only thing that would keep your teeth in your head. And then when I got into my 30s, ultra whitening crest was the only thing that would keep my teeth in my head. And now whatever it is now is the only toothpaste that will keep my teeth in my head. You always have to outdo the thing we just did. So not to be outdone, I've shown up my house, palace, my riches, my servants, my food. We've had an orgy fest for 140 days now. What's the, oh, hey, my wife's cute. Bring her out. Like, this is what you do when you're drunk. You have your best ideas when you're drunk. My best ideas always come out drunk. Yours, Greg? So, of course, he waited for this when he was, quote unquote, merry with wine. Merry with wine, right? And who doesn't like a drunk person calling you to perform? Nobody doesn't like that. It's always awesome. She's having no part of it, so she doesn't go. So he sends his chamberlains, eunuchs, and she said, nope, I'm not going. And now she's going to lose her position. What's it? And she's going to lose her position because the king's mad because she's a rebellious woman, a rebellious wife, because she wouldn't, air quotes, submit to him. So he casts her out, takes away her estate. Her disobedience, if you're looking at the Bible and this guy and what's going on here, her disobedience is a symptom of something else. It's not that she's a rebellious woman. It's not even really a refusal to obey to be put on display in front of a bunch of drunks. It's indicative of his house and how he rules his house. If he was ruling his house well, A, it would be a 140-day party. B, he wouldn't be trying to show off. He's already the king. What has he got to show anybody? And C, he certainly wouldn't put his wife on display like that. But that's what's happening. Now he's embarrassed. And he's embarrassed not because she refused. He's embarrassed the root cause is he didn't rule his house well. He wasn't ruling his own house well, and it came back to bite him in a public way. So he's embarrassed. If he was ruling his house well, the queen probably would have been, at least the queen would have been invited to the party, right? So he's kind of a jerk. But hey, Gentile Persian kings are right out of the pit of hell, so he's right where he's supposed to be. But the purpose of his command to come out there was to show her off and impress people for his good, not for hers. So that's it. He's just showing her off. He's not honoring his wife. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, so she's off the scene now. We hear about her again, but she's no longer. She's put aside. So look in verse 2, chapter 2, verse 1 through 7. And after these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins of Shushan to the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Hegi, the king's chamber, the keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, of course it did, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, of Benjamin, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, who Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that's her real name, which is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So there's a time period between chapter 1 and chapter 2. It's about 4 years. Okay, in chapter 1, verse 3, you see in the 3rd year of his reign. In chapter 2, verse 16, we see it's now the 7th year of his reign. There's a 4-year period of time. And history books say that it's during this time that he went to Greece to attack Greece, and Greece handed his rear end. So he comes back, and so that's where the history books end off. They just say that. Commentaries say he's really bummed out about Vashti. That's the commentaries are funny. Don't read it. Only I can. So anyways, history tells us that he invaded Greece and got defeated and came back. So he had taken over Babylon from Nebuchadnezzar. The Persians came and took Babylon under Cyrus. And Cyrus had the decree that let the Jews go back in. Well, that's what's going on. But even if he, and if he did, if he was bummed out about what he did, he can't take it back because he wrote down a law. And apparently when they wrote down the law couldn't be undone. So we see this playing later on when there's a law made against the Jews that on this day we're going to kill all the Jews. And now what do you do? The law is the law. So now, so anyways, so we had to stick with the law. So this best next thing was, instead of making things right, he's the king, by the way. I guess the king can't make his own laws except when he wants to. But anyways, what I found interesting in this book was how tied the pagans were to the law, and how when the law was the law, they had to obey the law, whereas God's people had a law, and as soon as they made the law, they break the law. Last book in Nehemiah, they had a law, they double wrote it, signed it, and broke it in the next verse. And he's like, it's so quick. But anyways, before you get all weepy about these pagans, the king's advisors said, I know what you need. You need God. You need a harem of virgins to distract you from the misery that your life is, because you're the king. Your life is really terrible. So you need this, king. Now, when you surround yourself with sycophants, that's the kind of advice you get. The good old king thought it was a really good idea. Here comes chapter 2, verse 7. What's her name? Hadassah. That is Esther. That's her real name. Hadassah is the name that her parents gave her. Right? Esther is a Persian name that her captors gave her. Just like Daniel was called Belteshazzar. And the thing that's common about him is, while Daniel's buddies were all called by their Babylonian names. Daniel, the book of Daniel is named after the Jewish name, not Babylonian. The book of Esther is named after her Persian name rather than her Jewish name. It just has to have been written by Persians, in my opinion, which is awesome. Anyways, Hadassah means myrtle, like myrtle trees. Myrtle trees are like big deals. Esther is a Persian word that means star. She's the star. She's shining brightly. There's no telling if she got the name Esther before or after being brought to the palace, but one way or the other, her name was changed. They called her Esther. For some reason, this one and Daniel, they kind of cross over. Daniel gets to keep his name for his book, Esther. So, in this chapter, when you read it, what you find is the thing that got Esther favor was something that she had no power over. This is the way she looked. Something that only God could do. God gave her these looks, and that was the thing that was used to gain her favor. That's not to her detriment. That's just, it's a picture of she had nothing to offer except what God gave her, so she had that. And she didn't misuse it. She wasn't a riotous woman. She was a virgin, however old she was. Right? She was the way she was supposed to be, doing what she was supposed to do with everything that God gave her. Nothing else. So then you go into chapter 3 and you get the next guy that shows up, Haman, the anti-Semite. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. All the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Haman shouldn't exist. Haman is a thing that's left behind. It's one of those messes that were left behind that someone's going to have to deal with sooner or later. If you don't deal with the sin in your life, your kids will deal with it. I told my dad when his wife passed away, you need to clean up this stuff before you die. So I saw what he was doing. I'm like, you just don't leave this. And I did the same thing before that. I know it's after that. His parents, when they died, there was stuff in there. What am I supposed to do with this? I had a U-Haul truck and his, at that time, 65-year-old high school friend. My dad was out of the country, and I'm moving them from their apartment to the hospital. But literally, I'm like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what to throw away. It was key. So anyway, it was one of those messes that was left behind for their children to clean up. So here he is. He shouldn't even be alive. Look in verse 4 through 6. Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him. This is those people that were in the gate, the king's servants, when they spoke daily unto him. It came to pass when they spoke daily unto him, and hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw what that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. I wonder about the servants at the gate. If Mordecai was a servant at the gate and a Jew, it would stand to reason there'd be other servants at the gate that were Jews. And is it only the non-Jew servants at the gate that are ratting out Haman, ratting out Mordecai and provoking Haman to get mad? There's only one guy that won't do it. Haman's way up here. Mordecai is lower than the floor, right? Everyone in the whole place is bowing except this one lowly, nothing captive Jew that doesn't mean anything. And Haman didn't seem to notice until they brought it to his attention. And I can't help but wonder if it wasn't Jews telling him that. I don't know for sure, but what I know about Christianity, it was Jews. There are many ways to get ahead in life. One of them is found in 1 Thessalonians 4, that you study to be quiet and to do your own business and to work with your own hands as we commanded you. The other way is what we see a lot of in Christianity. The other way to stand out in the crowd is to knock someone down and stand on top of them. And that's the way it is in a lot of workplaces, and unfortunately that's the way it is in a lot of churches. That's the way it is in a lot of social circles. And it's especially easy because the people closest to you aren't looking for that knife that's coming in your back. They're not waiting kind of leaning into the hit. They're leaning into the punch. No one expects their friends, their relatives, their church people to attack them that way, but it happens. I don't know. That's just me. I think that way only because I've seen it over and over again for a couple of decades. But you can't say for sure that's happening. I'm throwing it out there because. Okay, chapter 4. Chapter 4. This is what we see. This is the right person at the right time. This is exactly the right person at the right time. The point, though, is if it wasn't this person, it would have been another person at the right time. It just would have been later. So, in chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. No, dude. Okay, I got it. Okay, when Mordecai perceived all that was done. So, what happens before this is Haman lifts the king up. Just like good old Tobiah and Sanballat did. You can't make a stand. You can't let it do. You got to get them all. And keep just kill them all. On the 13th of the month or 14th, I can't remember. We're just going to kill all Jews. He sends out letters to all the provinces, all 127 provinces, and all the governors, and said, 3 days from now, kill them all. Okay. So Mordecai in chapter 4 hears this. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And it came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, weeping, wailing. In those days, weeping, wailing, gnashing, tribulation, contest. Okay. And many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlain came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Esther so far had not told anybody in the palace that her real name was Hadasha. Nobody knows that she's a Jew. Mordecai had declared himself the Jew. Right? She was known as the pretty little Persian girl who had the favor of the king and the king's, the keeper of the women, I forget his name. And everything had been fine up to this point, but now it's coming to a head. It's about to blow. She's got to do something. She can't be a stealth Christian anymore. She can't be one of those people that are at McDonald's sitting down for the chicken nugget meal and pretend they're tying their shoes and nothing's related, so that nobody knows what you're doing. She now is about to have to go one way or the other, declare or not. But up till now, she's just a pretty girl that lives in the palace. It's one of the king's harem. Evil, bad, wicked Haman came along with Mordecai. Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. So now Haman, probably with a short man complex, fixed it where all Jews are going to be put to death, right? And all for crimes against the state. In chapter 3, back in chapter 3, verse 8, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. Like I said, it sounds a lot like Sanballat and Tobiah. They don't have anything. They don't have laws in the country. They're captives. They don't have anything. So anyways, they embellished their offenses to get the king's attention. Nobody said anything about laws being reversed for people. The only thing that's happened here is Haman is bent because one guy wouldn't bow down. And the few guys on the wall are egging him up. What do you do about it? You know what to go. They're trying to get him to kill Mordecai. And instead of just Mordecai, it's all the Jews. They're going to kill him all. So the pressure's on now. The pressure's on. Mordecai now wants Esther to go into the king and save them. He says, it's time. Everything's come to this point now. All the world has aligned now, and now you have to act. You're in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time. The question is, are you exactly the right person? And so he says those things. And in verse 10 of chapter 4, and again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death. she's telling him, look, I know what you want me to do, but if I do that, he can kill me. Except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. Well, I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. Keep going. Okay, so who is not called? There is one law of his to put him to death. So she can't just walk into the king without being called. She can, but only if she does. Then the king says, if he doesn't do anything, you're dead. That's the law. Wrote it down, not obey. So, just kind of opposite. If we don't walk into the king, then we're dead. So it's the opposite. Okay, so in verse 14, though, keep on reading in verse 12. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself, that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. If we get it, we're getting it. It's coming. There's nothing you can do about it. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is it. How do you know you're not that person? How do you know you're not the one? Me? I'm just a very little Jewish girl. I've got nothing to offer. Right? Key verse is right there in verse 14. Deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. God doesn't need you. You won't do it, someone else will. But how do you know you weren't brought into this place, into a church, into the bride of Christ for a reason? How do you know you weren't brought there for a reason? You were brought there for a reason. You're something about it. But I might lose my reputation. Huh? Next. Right? And what? Said the Bible. She might lose her life. And Mordecai's going, But if you do nothing, you're dead anyway. So what do you got to lose? So the people know that God's coming back and they're going to deliver them. Jeremiah said so. He was a bullfrog. He was a good friend of him. Anyways, Jeremiah had said so, and they believe that. So they all know throughout history that God has used Jews to bring that deliverance. And he's telling Esther, it's now or never. Do something or don't. If you don't, cool. Someone's going to do it, but you're dead. Your father's house is dead. You won't live long enough to enjoy it anyways. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So look at verse 15. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast ye for me. Now that's fair. And neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. That's fair. I also and my handmaids will fast likewise. That's more fair. That's not her saying, you live like this, I'm going to go back and eat this great food that we give me. It's kosher food. So she liked it. And so will I go into the king. And if I perish, I perish. But that's it right there. I'm taking a stand. If I'm dead, I'm dead. I'll keep going. Yeah, so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. Esther takes the plunge. If I perish, I perish. Here's your New Testament verse for that. Romans 14:8. For whether we live unto the Lord. Whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. It doesn't matter if you live or die. God doesn't care. Unfortunately, God doesn't care if I live or die. God cares if I take a stand. If I die taking a stand, well done, thou good and faithful servant. If I don't die taking a stand, if I die because I didn't take a stand, because that's what Mordecai said, don't take a stand, you're dead. Take a stand, you might be dead. If I die having not taken a stand, I got to stand up at the judgment seat of Christ next to a bunch of people that did. And I just think that's gross. That's a thing I don't want. I don't understand it fully, but it has to. If it's not true, then the rest of the Bible is not true. And if the rest of the Bible is true, then this is true. There's going to come a day when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an answer for the things that we've done in our body, whether they be good or bad. And the Bible says, therefore, knowing the terror of the Lord, you do persuade men. Like, what am I supposed to do with that when the world tells me that God is love, and God is peace, and that means that? But if God's love, he's going to beat the tar out of some people for not doing the right thing, like any father might have done with his kids. It's coming. So she took that stand. She was there for a reason. She stood up in it. She sees that she has been typically trying to gain personal advantage out of her situation. So she's thinking, think about this. I mean, she's just a young girl, captive, scared to death. Parents are gone, right? She's in the palace. She knows what's in her future. This is not good. She's got to be scared, but she's also alive and well-fed and well cared for and has favor among the servants. And she's got a pretty good deal going on. Well, like Moses did. Right? Pretty good deal being the son of a king. Pretty good deal being the queen of Persia. Not a bad deal coming her way. She's got to either do what God wants or what her flesh wants. And I've been saying it over and over again. We tend to try to find a way to get some personal gain out of the situation that God put us in. That's not why God put us in that situation. God raised up a deliverer, and her name happened to be Hadassah, a little Jewish girl who had nothing to offer except her looks that God gave her anyways. She was a Jew. She was worthless to them. They were nothing. They would, for fun, go roast them on a spit. I mean, these were nothing. They were animals to their captors. They weren't friends. We read about Daniel and we read about Esther and we think, oh, not bad. But that's not what it was like for the normal, everyday, average captive. She just happened to be good looking, and that was useful to the world. She was experienced in unmerited favor. She was experiencing something we call unmerited favor. I don't want to compare the unmerited favor of this Persian king to the unmerited favor of God, but she was experiencing grace in the eyes of this king for no other reason, for nothing that she had done merited that. But she realized there was something bigger going on, that she was a small player in a large story, and she was there by the providence of God. 1:20. According to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in the body, whether it be by life or death. For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. She's like, I get it. I get it. If I perish, I perish. I've got nothing to lose. I'm dead anyways. The decree's tomorrow. It's 2 days, 3 days long. The decree's in 3 days, and we're all dead anyways. So I've got nothing to lose. So she's not trying to scheme a way that, I'll just hide out now. He likes me out. No, it's like, that's not it. Her life became unimportant to her. And she realized that she had done nothing to gain the position she was in. She'd done nothing. She just was her. She was just her. Okay? There's probably a lot of other good-looking Jewish people in that area. God used Esther because Esther had one thing you can't see, and that was a heart for God and her people. Somewhere in this little Jewish girl was the heart of a hero that was willing to sacrifice everything she had to save a whole bunch of people. It's very commendable. She's willing to risk a death sentence. Willing loosely like Christ. Loosely like Christ. It's a weird word. That's why we're doing the whole book tonight. All right. So in chapter 5, we see this concept of coming to the throne with boldness. We see this in the New Testament. Chapter 5, verse 1 through 3. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel. And apparel is important. The garments are important in the Bible. It's always marked. Now it stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom. Anyone read Mark 21? For Herod feared John, this is New Testament, knowing that he was a just man and holy, and observed him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. And when a convenient day was come, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. And when the daughter of the said Herodias came in and danced, and pleased Herod and them that sat with him, The king said unto the damsel, ask me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. They swear unto her, whatsoever thou ask of me, I will give it thee, even half the kingdom. Okay, we'll give you the head of John the Baptist. Oh, so when the king said something, it became law. When God said something, these lost Gentile kings and this Herod are teaching us something about kings, right? And I think we're also getting a lesson, guys, that cut to hyperbole and get from it. So this is a blank check. So Herod and Ahasuerus are both writing checks that they might not want to cash, but once they write the checks, you don't cash it, or the detective over here will put it in jail. This is how it works. So there, in chapter 5, verse 6, we see the same. We see this again. Yeah, we see this. The Hatach went forth to Mordecai into the street in the city which was called King's Gate. Now, chapter 5. The king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. What is thy request? And you will have the kingdom shall be from thee. He says it twice. Look at chapter 5, verse 5. Then said the king, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So Esther says, I've got a request. And the king goes, I got this one. And Haman, he's going to take care of this thing. Esther. Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom. It shall be performed. He said it twice. He doubled down. This is like double dog dairy, man. Your tongue's going on. It's happening. It's a triple dog dairy. Come on, sooner or later, right? So that even he's doubling down. But Esther's kind of being circumspect. She's playing it wrong. She's not going. She's not trying to shock. She's not trying to demand. She's going, cool. Respectfully, just let this night pass. And we'll continue another night. I'll let you know. I'm right? She's asking respectfully, being obedient to the king. Verse 7, then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in thy sight, and if it please the king to grant my petition and perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them. And I will do tomorrow, as the king said. She's asking permission. Now, what if Vashti said, you know what? I'd love to do this. I'd love to do this. Maybe she's still queen, right? I don't know. But why would she? But Esther's playing it cool. It's going, I will obey you. Give me permission to not answer you right now. But I will obey you. She plays it cool. She learned, the last woman to go up against the king isn't there anymore, right? So if you look at the rest of the chapter, I don't want to read the whole thing, 7 through the end. Haman goes home, brags about his big job, and how people bow down to him, how he's over everyone, how well he's versed in manuscript evidence, church history, and all the 7 and all that stuff. He goes home and brags about all this stuff in the rest of that chapter. But Haman proves to us once again that all the power and riches of the world won't satisfy a soul that's devoid of the Holy Spirit of God. He's got this God-sized hole in his heart. Nothing he puts in there will fit. Nothing is big enough. Nothing's the right shape. Nothing's going to work for him. He's got everything a guy in his position could ever want. He's the number 2 guy in the Persian kingdom. Everyone except the king is below him. But all he wants is one guy to bow down. It's craziness. He's willing to risk it all. He puts himself in a really bad place. And in verse 13 of that chapter, after Queen Esther says that in verse 8, in verse 9, then went Haman forth that day joyful and glad. When Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, he stood up and unroofed him his food and nations. What the king does is tells Haman, Haman, I've got an important job for you. Now, you know, this thing together, and he goes on, man, I'm going to do this. He has no idea what he's about to have to do. It's great. And in verse 13, he's talking about all the things you've got. Look in verse 12. And Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come to the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. I was queen. He has no idea this is Mordecai's. He's no clue whatsoever. All he knows is the king and the queen, because if the king dies, the queen's in charge. So the top 2 people in the country And anyway, the banquet that she had prepared, but myself, and tomorrow I am invited unto her also with the king. Me the president, right? Yet all this availeth me nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting against me. All this stuff means nothing because of this one lowly captive Jew that means nothing to anybody. Where am I? Okay. That thorn in the flesh that Paul prays about in the New Testament is the same thing. The difference is Paul prayed that God would take away the thorn in the flesh. Haman didn't have it. Pray to. He's going to take care of it himself. It matters in his own hands. So in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, you see this: no rest for the weary. This guy, turns out this guy in chapter 6 was going to sell his house and move to Arkansas. A whole bunch of people prayed that he wouldn't sleep for them. Okay, chapter 6, verse 1 through 3. On that night could not the king sleep. And he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthan, Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keeper to the door, who sought to lay hand on the king, Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. Now, the king doesn't know that Mordecai is Esther's because he put it against him. Somewhere in these record books, there's a record of Mordecai reporting about a palace coup, palace takeover. And these two guys that were planning to kill the king. And these guys happen to literally be door guards. They were the guards at the door. Who could get to him better than that? They're eunuchs, and they wanted the king dead. But Mordecai had somehow thwarted that plan, and so someone had a record of that. So just as the king finds this out, Haman arrives to tell the king about his bad day and how good old Morty wouldn't bow down to him. And the only way he can ever be happy is to kill them all. And the only problem for Haman is so full of himself that he lacks any self-awareness or discernment whatsoever. Look in chapter 6, verses 4 through 6. And the king said, who's in the court? Now Haman was coming to the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. The king said, let him come in. So Haman came in. The king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom the king delights to do honor? He said, kind of a big deal. Everyone bows to me. I'm important. I'm the man. It's a lack of self-awareness. To whom would the king delight to do honor more than himself? It's kind of an arrogant thing to say, no matter who you are. It's just arrogant. Like one guy told me, when you get in the end zone, you got to act like you've been in before. He's kind of doing a happy dance. He's got a hold of one ball. Like, you ever got one? No. Oh, say that. And things. And I never got any. Okay, I played that hole a dozen times since. I've never got less than 6. So, anyways, he gets a sudden burst of attention from the guy in charge. Of course, he's a man among men. He's the best, better than everybody else. Who else could the king be talking about? So he forgets about why he's even there. And he tells the king, Haman answered the king, for the man the king delighted to honor, let rock, which the king use it to wear. And of course, the king, right? He's asking for the king's clothes, the king's horse, and the crown which is on your head. I want your horse, I want your clothes, I want your crown, I want to be you. I will ascend above the throne of God. So Lucifer in Isaiah. This is Haman. This is his real heart. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighted to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighted to honor. The king said to him, make haste, take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all things. Okay, yeah, go do that. Even do so to Mordecai the Jew. But don't forget, Esther had called a party, and Haman's late because he left her going, "Oh man, I ain't going. I'm not going to that party." So he stayed home. Now he's late to the queen's party, right? You see this in verse 14. He's decrying his horrible fate now. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hastened to bring him to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So nobody knows who's who yet. Haman knows now what's going on, right? The king doesn't know that Mordecai is related to Esther, right? Haman doesn't know that Esther is related to Mordecai, but Haman knows that he has just lost his position in the kingdom, one way or the other. I don't think he exactly knows what else is going to happen, but he's about to get invited to a necktie party that he started in chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, "What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed." After the king, triple dog there, here it is, tongue's going on that icy pole. And then Esther, the queen, answered and said, "If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king," so, if I found favor, and if it pleases you, king, just being very respectful, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request, for we are sold. I and my people to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I'd have held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, "Who is he, and where is he that doth presume in his heart to say?" And Esther said, "The adversary," there it is, and enemy, there it is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid for the king and queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went unto the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen. For he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So she tells the king, "Look, we've been sold out. We've been sold out. If we were just sold to be slaves, cool. Nothing's different. We're already bonded, right? But it's worse. They want to kill us. And oh, by the way, it's Haman. And Haman throws himself at the feet of Esther, begging for his life. And in doing so, he winds up on her bed that she was lying on. Is it verse 8? Yeah, then the king returned out of the palace garden unto the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bedward. So the king walks in. Haman's laying on the bed with Esther. We got a problem now. So he's adding insult to injury. And in verse 8, the king says, will he force the queen also? Where is that? In verse 8, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Probably with a sack over his head. You're done. Sackhead. There you go. So had Haman even thought about it, without getting his ego bunched up on one side of his trousers, he would have perhaps spoken to Mordecai on his way back to this. When he found out what was going on, he could have made friends with Mordecai. No, he didn't. He went home to whine to his family about someone else's good fortune. So he's not satisfied with his own fortune, but he's really obsessed with the good fortune of somebody else. And in his desperate begging, he's now actually causing further indignity to the king by laying on the queen's bed. So Haman had built this gallows 50 cubits high. So 75 feet, if you call a cubit 18 inches. That's 75 feet. Huh? 35. I thought a cubit was like 18 inches. A foot and a half times 50 is 75 feet. So, I mean, that's just if you consider it that, right? So, it's in his own house. In his own house. He probably wanted his family to be really proud when he brought Mordecai home to hang. That's the kind of guy that Haman was. Evil, bad, wicked Haman. And he probably would have been the first of many, right? Because remember, they're going to kill all the Jews on that day. He laid a snare for Mordecai, but he found himself in his own snare. Proverbs 29:25, fear of man bringeth the snare. Whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. Haman was a scared little man. He wasn't important. He just weaseled his way into a position of power, and even that wasn't good enough. Like, I need to learn how to be satisfied with where I'm at. Because I'm just that man. Where I came from, my life, I have no business standing there. And Haman never quite got that. His position and title and power weren't enough, and he's now afraid of a powerless little Jewish captive that had nothing. Yesterday, Mordecai was in sackcloth and ashes, fearing for his life, fasting and praying for us, the thing that God has for us. I've got all this long list of things that God's given me. I'm over here focused on the one thing I don't have that you might have. Now I scheme to get it from you. It backfires. All because one little man wouldn't bow to him and stroke his ego. He's now hanging at his own neck. So now we got chapter 8. Remember, there's a decree from the king to kill all Jews. You can't undo that, but you can do something else. In verse 1 and 2, on that day, there's another phrase, on that day, the second coming, that day, think that. Did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen? Well, we kind of got that when God gave, he took from the Jews and he put us in the place. But anyways, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he wasn't. So now the king knows. He didn't know this. He just saw an honorable guy doing honorable things and reported it. And the king took off his ring which he had given from Haman and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Esther spake yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman, Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. So the first two verses, they mirror Luke 14:11. For whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Haman had everything the world had to offer. He could not satisfy the one thing the world can't satisfy, and that's his ego. It's this, it just doesn't matter. Ego is like a fishbowl. If you have a fishbowl that's this big and you put a fish in it, the fish will get a certain size. If you give that fish a bigger fishbowl, the fish gets bigger. It's like me in pants. If I buy a bigger pant size, I'll fill it. It's a natural progression of things. Ego is just like a fishbowl. They can never be satisfied with the things that the world can give it. Where am I? Okay. But now there's this matter of the king's decree to kill all the Jews. So he wrote it down and sent it out. He licked the stamps himself, sent it out to 127 provinces that they're going to kill all these people. And when there's a law, or when the king made a decree, now it's also a law. There's no reversing it. So the king makes a decree that basically says this. All right, go ahead, kill them all. But the Jews are allowed to fight back. Just level the playing field for God's people. This king leveled the playing field against the world. I wouldn't even say we have a level playing field. We're way up here and the world's down here. We still seem to struggle against it, but he leveled the playing field. In chapter 8, verse 11, wherein the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy and slay, to cause to perish, all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and take spoil of them for a prey. So, okay, look, guys, you want to go kill them? Cool, I said you could. But now they can fight back. So things turn out differently. It's a lot easier to pick on someone that can't fight back. This is just this. I see it in the business world all the time. Managers, buildings that demean and otherwise degrade the people that work for them. What is that? They can't fight back. They can't even go to HR because HR is a friend of the company. It's like you can't do these things. I've seen it. There was this lady at work, didn't like her boss. She went to HR to complain. She was gone in 3 months. I mean, I just don't need that job. I told you that. You can't go do that. There's a way to do things, and that's not one of them. But anyways, it's easier to pick on someone that can't fight back. So both laws prevailed, and now the Jews have a choice. The people have a choice. Gang up on the Jews, get into a fight, or go another route. Looks like a lot of them took another route. Look in chapter 8, verse 16. The Jews had light and gladness, joy, and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness. feast of good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews. For the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Like, I can just see, like, how do these Jews do this thing? Every time we have them in a corner, they come back. I mean, if you think about Israel right now, there is no reason they should be. There's nothing special about them. They're not smarter than everybody. They're not stronger than everybody. They're not more fierce than anybody. But they're always there. The only ancient language spoken is Hebrew. Because nobody speaks Amalekite. Nobody speaks Chaldean. You got a few professors and some college knows some words, right? Nobody speaks that, but people still speak Hebrew on that little strip of land. It's supposed to be bigger, but they're still there. What is that? People throughout all of history have said, what's going on? So the fear came on them, and so a lot of them got converted. And when people see impossible things happen that only God can make happen, they want to convert. I mean, I've seen, when you as a Christian see things that don't make sense, that's the adversary. When a lost person sees something that doesn't line up with their theology of atheism, they know that's God. And when they see us conforming to the world, that confirms their God of atheism and denies the God that we know. They converted because of what they saw. They didn't convert because the Jews went over there and beat them with every King James 1611 of the Bible. They converted because of the thing they saw happen. They saw these people just being those people, and somehow something intervened on their behalf. So it wasn't good enough for them to just not pick a fight. That's all they had to do. The people, all they had to do was not attack Israel. And they would have been okay. Remember, the decree says you can kill them if you want, but they can fight back. The decree didn't say they can kill you. So they literally converted because they saw something going on there that made no sense to their worldly ways. They said that must be their God, must be real. So they converted. They were up against something that made no logical sense. So when a Christian sees something that makes no logical sense, we know that's the adversary. The world sees it, it's not logical in the gods of their life. Sometimes they jump to a logical conclusion that the God of heaven did it and they want to convert. Now, a lot of these people fought. They died. But there's also something about it they shouldn't win. That 67 war, they shouldn't win. Egypt, back to it, they thought they were tanks. There were no tanks. They thought they were American tanks. Just, you tell me how it happened. I've seen their planes. I've been to their museums. They were throwing bombs this big out the open cockpit of a Bible plane. Everybody else had jets and bombs and tanks and artillery. It's got to be. So anyways, if you look at verse 16, chapter 8, 16, the Jews had light, gladness, joy, honor. That's a pretty good deal. Why did I say that? Because they didn't have darkness and sadness and fear and dishonor. That leap of faith that Esther took back in chapter 4, verse 16. I perished, she paid off. She just took a stand. She didn't bring anything with her other than what God gave her. She didn't have anything other than what Mordecai probably taught her as a child about God. She was separated from her parents. She was separated from her uncle. There had been a long period of time that she was in that harem, so she had no real contact with anybody except all the influences in her life were Persian. The keeper of the women was a Persian, but she found favor with him. The king was a Persian. She found favor with him, but she didn't compromise her way. If you read the book, she ate her own food. I'm assuming it was kosher food. Again, just let me eat bugs. Don't make me eat the king's meat. It's profane. You can't do it. And somehow he found favor with his brother. She just was who she was. And then she risked her life on the chance that it was true, whether to live or die. It's God. She took that stand and paid off. And then in chapter 9, you have this thing called the Feast of Purim, which is this is one feast you want to teach. Maybe I did when I was younger. In verse 11, 9/11, on that day, the number that were slain in Shushan, the palace, was brought before the king. So on that day, this is a picture of the second coming of Christ, when the enemies of God's people are dying, and they're dying in droves in chapter 8 and 9. Because a lot of them said, yeah, we're going to fight. And the Jews said, okay, we're going to fight back. And they win. Anyways, twist with this was the day. On this day was the day that the adversary had scheduled to win the final battle. All Jews were supposed to be killed on this day. And instead, a lot of people are converting, and a lot of enemies are dying, and the Jews had joy, gladness, and honor instead of darkness, and sadness, and fear. This chapter is what we know, about Jews. It's the Feast of Purim. Purim, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's a day that celebrates their faith, moving from sorrow to joy, from sadness to gladness. Okay? What they do on this day, they read what they call the Megillah, not Megillah, the Megillah. It's the 5 wisdom books in Esther. So they read this book on that day. They give gifts to each other. They give gifts to the poor. And they throw a really big feast. But that's not the best part. Tradition says they're supposed to drink so much that they can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. They're supposed to drink themselves silly. So it's kind of modified now. They drink something. They have alcoholic drink that day. Huh? Did you ever, you did? Did they get drunk or just have a drink? Did they have a drink? They drank. Okay. So anyways, so then chapter 10, you got this rags to riches story here. This is really, it's just 3 verses. And the king Ahasuerus laid tribute on the land. He taxed the land upon the isles of the sea. And all the acts of his power and might, the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all the sea. The king taxes people, promotes Mordecai to the second in his whole kingdom. If you see it enough there, you see a picture there. The king and the second in command, really. So here's this book where we saw a queen that was deposed because she wouldn't put up with her drunk, bad husband. Her bad faith. But, that was kind of honorable what she did. She knew what she'd lose. She did it anyway. She stood. She took a stand. She took a stand and she lost. Esther took a stand and won. It's just the way it is. We see that somehow in this book, a young Jewish captive woman with nothing to offer anyone except God. What God gave her. She had nothing to offer except what God gave her. She obtains favor in the sight of the eunuch in the house of the king. She obtains favor of the king. But what we also probably see is this young, pretty Jewish girl probably had a personality effect. She probably had a demeanor that didn't sour people when they looked at her. Oh, she sure looks nice, but boy, she was a nice person, I guess. Because Vashti was a beautiful woman too. It just wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for her drunk husband to leave her alone that night. You see a man named Mordecai who's gone above and beyond. This was his uncle's kid. It wasn't like it was his daughter. It wasn't his brother's daughter. It wasn't his niece. It was a cousin. It's like a second cousin. No, it was a cousin. Yeah, straight up cousin. So he's a good guy. When Haman got the king all worked up about the Jews, the king made a decree that people could destroy Jews. And that law stands to the end of the book. The world is designed to destroy God's people. But God gave us a way to fight that without fighting. We're not supposed to fight. We're supposed to take a stand. Esther didn't fight. She took a stand. She said, if I perish, I perish. She stood up, walked in before the king with boldness under the throne, and the king said, here's a scepter. I walked in front of the king. He could have lopped my head off. He should have. But he, quote unquote, handed me the gold scepter. He said, come on in. Let's go. That's all I've been waiting for you this whole time. We see the king made another decree and said, you can fight back. But we also notice that the king told people that they could do it on their own time. He didn't order the army to kill the Jews. He said, if you want to kill Jews, go ahead. Right? God had to be working on this thing. Because if I'm the king, I want something done. I'm not going to start in this place, go to all 127 places, don't come back till you're done, and all the Jews are dead. Kind of like God did with Saul. Saul didn't do it. He left us to deal with Haman because it should have not been more. So, remember, we take a stand. Just take the stand. Galatians 6:13, wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day. That was an evil day. That day of Purim was an evil day until the Jews were able to fight back. And having done all to stand, the Jews took a stand and God leveled the playing field. The Jews had to stand. They had to stand first. Like they had to say, we're willing to use the word of the king. The king told me I could do something. They had to do it. Esther knew something was going to save Israel. She just happened to be the one to sit up and did it. God will act on our behalf, but he won't negate our need to act, to stand. We have to do something when the time comes out. When the time came, Esther took a stand and said, if I perish, I perish. The outcome's in God's hands. But it took Esther to get on her feet and take that leap of faith. That's everything I can get out of that book. So you got something else. Start your own church. Father, we just thank you again for giving us this book. Even the parts I don't fully understand, Lord, I know there's things in there that we need to know. You would have us know. That's right. Father, I pray that what we heard tonight, we'd somehow functionalize in our hearts and minds and act like we understand. Lord, bring us all back together on Sunday. Let's have a good time at our picnic. And ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.